These companies banded together so as to pay the farmers an artificially low price. The farmers of Ghana, then the Gold Coast, nonetheless worked so well that they became the world's biggest producers of cocoa, and so of chocolate, which Africans didn't eat. But the gains were far from equally shared. The Ghanaian historian, Professor Ado Boahen.
There's no doubt at all that the farmers were being cheated. The prices that were being paid for the cocoa bore no relationship to the prices that they had to pay for the imported goods. We had no say in the pricing of our own commodities. We had no say in what we paid for what was imported. This was, in fact, one of the greatest indictments against the colonial economic policies. The fact that so much emphasis was placed on a single cash crop. And we had to import rice, we had to import oil, palm oil, and so on, to feed ourselves, because so much emphasis and so much attention was paid to this single cash crop cocoa. The colonial governments were just concerned with obtaining raw materials to feed their factories abroad.
The raw materials were produced by the skill and enterprise of hard-working African men and women. Yet the advertisements in Europe, deeply racist by this time, presented an insultingly different picture. At the same time, African businessmen found that the trading positions they had established in earlier times were now swept away.
There's no doubt at all that before the colonial period, Africans were playing a far more important and dominant role in the economy than during the colonial period. There were many of them running their own import-export businesses. In the 1920s and 1930s, all these African merchant princes virtually disappeared from the field because the dice was so much loaded against them as a result of the colonial system. The banks were discriminating against them in the granting of loans. The expatriate firms, and particularly the Syrian and Lebanese firms, were undercutting them, and they just could not stand the challenge. And therefore, many of them simply ran out of business. And the children of these great merchant princes now became the employees of the great African capitalist companies like UAC, UTC, SUA, and so on.
Colonial trading companies, British, French, Belgian, Portuguese, monopolized wholesale business with the full backing of their colonial governments. What King Leopold had called this magnificent African cake was beginning to yield its riches. Often those were painful days, but they have to be recalled by anyone who wishes to understand the problems of Africa now. The turmoil of today in the Congo or Zaire has its roots in the infamous Congo Free State of King Leopold. Here the emphasis was on the growing of rubber, and the methods used to extract it were no better than a reign of terror. Local people were forced to collect rubber under the most cruel conditions, as these old photographs show. If the rubber they collected was poor or small in quantity, men, and sometimes women too, could expect to lose a hand or foot in punishment. Terrible things were done. An official British fact-finding commission reported. The daily agony of an entire people unrolled itself in all its repulsive, terrifying details. Public opinion in Europe grew horrified. Gradually, the agonies were reduced. Yet huge damage had been done, moral as well as physical, and was going to cast a dark and violent shadow over the future of the Congo. Forced labor by the 1920s was practiced on a wide scale in most of the colonies. All early roads and railways were built by forced labor. Much was achieved, but the cost in life and health was sometimes catastrophic. This spectacular railway in French Equatorial Africa was built by 125,000 Africans to link the coast with Brazzaville, the inland capital. Beyond doubt, a great feat of engineering. But before a single passenger could travel on it, nearly 14,000 Africans were to die in building it. Travel in comfort came at a price. By the 1920s, the colonial railway map was complete. These lines had one central purpose: to ensure the export of minerals and other wealth, most of all from southern Africa. European mining activity for gold, copper, zinc, diamonds transformed southern Africa, thanks again to African labour acquired by the usual procedure of administrative force and taxation. Conditions were hard to bear. Some 30,000 Africans died in southern Rhodesian mines between 1904 and 1933, mostly of disease. And wages at the end of that period were lower than they'd been at the start. This labour system was called Chibaro. Very old men can still remember it.
Apana umuntu wanga chiramba wanga vachienda zvavo kuchibharo kuti vata chibharo waitaulirwa ishe vobvisa vanhu voenda kuchibharo kubasa.
Gold mining boomed. In those years of Chibaro, the southern Rhodesian mining industry produced gold worth £87 million sterling, at the cost of 20 dead African miners each week on average for 30 years. Just as in the bigger mines of South Africa, living conditions for miners were appalling. Safety provisions were primitive. Discipline was often brutal. Healthcare almost non-existent. Prison labour was used whenever available, and that was often. And child labour too.
Takamboenda asiri vakomana so taenda kuchibharo kwanzi kunodikanwa vanhu kubasa.
After 1930, the whole labour system in large regions had come to depend on people having to abandon their villages and go far away to work in colonial mines or on plantations. This was called migrant labour, a huge upheaval which soon began to destroy the old stabilities of rural Africa. An official British committee in 1935 reported that the old order of society was being completely undermined by migrant labour. The years ahead were going to confirm it. But it was in the Portuguese colonies, especially Angola and Mozambique, that forced labour was at its worst. Here in Mozambique, and by brutal methods, African farmers were forced to grow cotton and to sell it at prices fixed by the colonial government. Prices kept so low that the farmers used to say of the cotton that they were forced to grow that cotton was the mother of poverty. The raw cotton was sent to textile factories in Portugal and returned in the form of shirts for Africans to buy. All the profits were Portuguese. The more the farmers learned to hate cotton, the more they were forced to grow it on pain of severe punishment.
Senzaku lisinzisa tiko hinkwaro akuari byala thonji atiko hila lingasungula kushaniseka hakona avakapataji avafamba amintini nemasin'wini loko bile dina vakhumuka avalandziwa vayatekiwa vabiwa etintshilani vaya masin'wini na vangadlanga
yexitador vadanikhoma sinajele akuwena uwena xitador wa ku dyeteka vana va ha ri mukwatithonji na hi ku ba siniyala sinikangateliwa ni ba xipakani va ba xipakani xa unharhu ni ku swa ringana si va jele 15 days jele.
The farmers in this old film had no legal means of protest. but they could express their anger by singing anti-colonial songs in their own language. There seemed then no way out, no hope ahead. And before long, the same disaster struck here as elsewhere. Food crops disappeared, and once prosperous areas were hit by famine.
Sorry. Kunene tindlela tive tikulu nkama lowo hikusa aloku amutini lwangani vasati vambiri vanharhu hinkwavo avanyikiwa masimu ya thonji. Kutani athonji alishakuluwa kanharhu thonji. Kutani akungari na nkama wa kutirha masimu. Akungari na nkama wa kuveni hi tirha masimu ya hina hi byala mavele leswi fanekelaka ha kona ni leswi hinkwaswo a li karhi hi tirha swona swa tifijao ni timavele ni hinkwaswo. Se a tindlela ti kula hi ndlela yoleyo.
In spite of African suffering, settlers arrived in growing numbers. Some were political exiles from the Portuguese dictatorship. Many were poor people hoping for a better life. Sent out to be farmers, most preferred the easier life of the towns. They opened shops and businesses and aimed at the success which had eluded them at home. This actually suited the official colonial doctrine. The Portuguese dictator Marcelo Caetano laid it down in plain words. The blacks are to be organized and enclosed, he said, in an economy directed by whites.
Loko ni sungula ku vulavula ni te Kadi Mshadore ni sekretari wakwe leswaku a governo wa Maputukezi I governo leyi nga twala misaveni hinkwayo hi vunene bya yona. Kambe n'wina va-administradori mugene governo wa Maputukezi Africa a nga ta va kona hikusa a mu landzanga a swileleto leswi mu nga tela swona Africa.
Mass resistance was to develop later. But already even the poorest and least educated Africans could see that colonial rule had much more to take than to give. Whatever good may have come from colonial rule has to be measured, unfortunately, against the essential aims of each of the colonial systems. These aims were frankly stated. They were to extract wealth. We've looked at some of the ways in which wealth was extracted, by the use of forced or cheap labor, by the seizure of land, by the incessant pressure on growing crops for export rather than crops for local food needs, and always by the deliberate treatment of Africans as inferior beings. Whatever appearances might suggest, Africans in fact were no longer prepared to accept their permanently inferior status.